Welcome to Holistic Health Heroes, here to help you become your own health advocate and introduce you to some heroes in the holistic health arena. Let's get started. Okay, well, I'm sitting here today with my guest, Nora Gedgaudas, who is a board-certified nutritional consultant and clinical neurofeedback specialist with more than 20 years of highly successful clinical experience. She's also an internationally acclaimed ketogenic and ancestral-based nutrition specialist.
Yeah.
And the best-selling author of Primal Body, Primal Mind, along with two other books, Primal Fat Burner and Rethinking Fatigue. And she serves on the board of a long-standing organization I'm aware of called the Price-Pottenger Nutrition Foundation. And by the way, I learned that Nora lives off-grid in
Oh, yes.
Homestead area of Idaho. So I'm so excited to talk to you about that. Nora, welcome.
Yeah. Thank you, Kira. It's really an honor and a pleasure to be here. I really enjoy doing these.
Oh,
So,
I'm just thrilled to have you here because like we were talking before we jumped on today, how I met one of your colleagues for Price Pottenger's Foundation at the Weston Price Conference. So
yeah.
yeah, so I feel a great need to educate people on that. But before we get there, the first thing I have to ask you, I've been just chomping at the bit to ask you this. What was it like living with wolves?
Um, I like to describe it as a fairly industrial strength religious experience. If you would have asked me when I was 5 years old what my dream was in life, because I had read Farley Mowatt's Never Cry Wolf, you know, and it would have been to go to the Arctic and live with a family of wild wolves. That's, what I thought I wanted. And in 1991, I had that opportunity. I had, through a string of serendipitous events, I made the acquaintance of and ended up becoming very close friends with a famous wolf biologist by the name of L. David Meach. And Dave had, and I worked with him, radio calling wolves, following them from bush plains and things like that, and tracking them on the ground and examining the kills and all that cool stuff. And also there was a captive population that we were doing some studies with. And my whole life I'd had an avid interest in wolves. When I was a little kid, I mean, my little Bible was, Dave Meach's book, The Wolf. And I used to think, I used to sit there just thinking, wow, maybe someday I'll get to meet him and shake his hand. It's like this really big deal. And
Wow.
gosh, what I love to get into like a time machine and go back to that little girl sitting, just dreaming about this stuff and say, guess what you're going to get to do? And guess with who,
That's amazing.
Yeah. So spent an entire summer less than 500 miles from the North Pole. And Dave had found this these wolves a few years prior, where a polar explorer by the name of Will Steger had led an international expedition to the North Pole, basically trying to basically do what Admiral Peary had done. Because there was a lot of controversy. Did Peary actually make it to the North Pole, or didn't he? His trip to the pole was unresupplied. He just had his supplies with him and the dog teams, and used the sextant to navigate and all of that. And they decided to recreate that whole, that's the word I was looking for, that whole adventure, to prove that Peary had done it, and they managed to do that.
Oh.
And at the time, there was a National Geographic photographer that was chronicling the launch of this expedition from northern Ellesmere Island, and uh, and these wolves were sort of hanging around, and so he called Dave, and Dave flew up there, and they spent time following these wolves around and realized that they had no fear of humans. They had never been hunted. They lived so remotely that they had never been hunted. And the closest human population center to where we were, well, and of course, Dave went back the following spring, in a needle in a haystack miraculous fashion, found the den, because there's only like one such den in 1,000 square miles, and he found it. And he spent the next, I don't know, couple decades at least, I think, going up there every single summer and living with that family of wolves and just observing what he could. And they knew him, but he, his interactions with them were limited because he wanted to observe them as naturally as possible.
Wow.
And it was a couple years, there was a National Geographic film called White Wolf that was about that family of wolves. And I had worked with Dave for a few years, and we went out to lunch, and he said, Nora, it's like this dream come true. I found these wolves, and he said, would you want to go? And it's like, are you kidding me? Like sign me up yesterday, right?
Yeah.
And so it was just him and me for a good part of the summer. He went back. He traveled back to Minnesota for a couple of weeks, leaving me up there, which was great. And then came back up again because he had some business to attend to. But other than that,
Yeah.
just spent
Changing.
that whole summer just, following them on their hunts and watching what they did. And
Would you say that was the pivotal experience that sort of put you on the trajectory for your life path?
well, so I had been an avid sort of very passionate about nutrition for, since my late teens, really. I had, read everything I could get my hands on, but I really didn't have any central, um, core kind of basis from which to operate. A lot of people, when you have a health food store, veganism and vegetarianism tend to be very popular. When you go to those places. Um, and that sort of was always promoted as like the healthiest way to do things. I attempted that, and I developed an eating disorder. It was horrible, actually. It didn't last me but a year, I think, and I felt like I'd failed somehow.
Yeah.
And then I get up to Ellesmere, and I'm sitting there looking out over this vast expanse of tundra that wasn't even glaciated during the last ice age. All the glaciers started south of there. Um, and I realized that this probably looks a lot like Northern Europe looked, when Cro-Magnon humans went marching across, and there wasn't really anything growing that you could eat.
Nothing.
And there were ancient human cultural sites all over where we were there, many of which had never even been touched by archaeologists. And so, of course, I brought home a few artifacts. I couldn't resist.
Yeah.
But I realized that with the permafrost and everything else, there weren't even berries up there, and there was nothing. Um, and the plants just weren't plants that humans were gonna. And we don't make very efficient use of plants anyway, which is something I can harp on.
Mhm.
But it 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 niggled at me, right? And the other thing that niggled at me was that sitting out there on the tundra, very well bundled against the cold, I was never uncomfortably cold, but um, I found that I was developing these just incredible cravings for
Mm.
fat-rich foods. So I'm sitting there eating salami and cheese. I mean, I won't say it was the healthiest representations of things fat-wise. We had a bunch of stuff we brought with us, that we supplied ourselves with that were going to last the summer,
Right.
and occasionally hunted for things. Um, but nut butters, whatever. I was obsessed with that. And there was a military weather station that wasn't terribly far from where we were. And once a week, we'd make this pilgrimage all the way out to that military weather station. And we were friendly with the officer in charge there. And she just said, hey, if you go into the mess hall, we'd go at 3 o'clock in the morning. It was 24-hour daylight, and go into the mess hall. And she said, if you see something laying out, it's fair game. Go, you can eat it. Well, I walked into the mess hall, and there was the light of heaven shining on this huge bowl of butter, and I just, there was some bread there. It's like, okay, there's a vehicle for the butter. The bread didn't look good to me, but it was something to put the butter on. So I was making toast and just eating slice after slice until I was too embarrassed to continue. And at the end of that summer of sitting around on my ass on the tundra, eating fat-rich foods with almost no vegetables, hardly at all. We had a few onions along, and whatever that things that would keep, but I lost about 25 pounds that
Mm.
summer. In fact, I got off the plane and I hugged my friend, and they just said, "Did you do this on purpose?" Because I had lost so much weight. I'm like, "No, I sat on my ass and ate all day long." You know?
Wow.
So, that all that just kind of it niggled at me. It's like, what was that?
Right.
And how did these humans that thrived in this environment, this really harsh environment, how did they do that?
Yeah.
And then I stumbled across a very tattered copy of Nutrition and Physical Degeneration. And I started thumbing through it, looking at the pictures, and I went, holy crap.
Yeah.
Bam,
Bingo. Yeah.
bingo. And so I became a student of Weston Price's work for a little bit, and then actually, don't tell my colleagues on the Price-Pottenger board, although they all know this, but it didn't go back far enough for me, because to me there were selective pressures that shaped us as a species much, 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 much earlier than that.
Mhm. Mm.
Now, the diet of the Inuit in the high Arctic, and the Thule people that lived there, and other cultures that even preceded the Thules, you know, that would have been probably the closest thing to a true Stone Age, prehistoric Stone Age diet that anybody um, had, consumed in a very long time. But I just really wanted to go back and figure out, how did we get to be how we are.
Right.
And one of the things, so a lot of people promoting things called like the paleo diet and that kind of stuff.
Mm.
When when I wrote Primal Body, Primal Mind, I wrote it because nobody else would. And I just thought, okay, I have some, interesting ideas here. And I just wanted to get it out there with no delusions of grandeur. I didn't even have marketing in mind at all. It was just like something I really wanted to do. I was passionate to
Coming from your
communicate.
soul. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. And and suddenly I'm getting invited to speak at UCLA and go to Australia. And I found myself on the crest of a wave I didn't even know existed. And that was this emerging new kind of ancestral health movement, paleo movement, etc. And of course, the title of my very first book was Beyond the Paleo Diet, the subtitle, Beyond the Paleo Diet for Total Health and Longer Life, because I really didn't think very much of the kind of standard paleo diets that were being promoted at the time.
Right. Yeah. There's lots of problems with those, I would say.
Yeah, there are. But, somehow I managed to squeak into that crowd anyway. And I think a lot of the bigger names at the time, were thinking, well, that's extreme. I was advocating for basically a fat-based metabolism, right? One that relies on fat as a primary source of fuel as opposed to blood sugar, which
Hmm.
was a major theme in my two print books, which were Primal Body, Primal Mind, and Primal Fat Burner, which sounds like a weight loss book, which, that's not the main feature of it, but it's a double entendre. So, um, and and a lot of people at that time just thought, well, that's just kind of extreme and weird, and we all like our sweet potatoes and we like our whatever. And it's like, okay, I mean, paleo crowd loved its num nums and yam yams, and then there were all these. And I predicted this is going to get taken over by industry, right? This and what do you know? As soon as the paleo movement takes off, now there are all these prepackaged little snackies,
Of course.
um,
The marketing.
paleo friendly,
Yeah.
yeah. And I, you know,
Same with keto now, I would say. Keto this, keto that, keto
well,
cookies, for heaven's sakes.
yeah, well, there are just as many versions of paleo and keto as there are people claiming to practice it, and I found that very frustrating. And then when the keto thing suddenly, a few years into all of this, suddenly took hold, everything I'd been saying was like, um, now it was fashionable. And I sort of got trampled by this crowd who wanted to market this whole new thing. They just were kind of going with the flow of popular interest. And uh, it was a little frustrating for me. But my core message, and I was able to come at it from a wide variety of of angles because I have good background in functional medicine and functional nutrition and all of that. And I had a nuanced grasp of all of that. Um, but there were, I mean, people are slugging MCT oil and they're doing this, that, and doing all this stuff. Um, and I've always had a lot of problems with that. I believe in paying close attention to what our ancestors knew, consuming food in as close to its natural state as you can. And obviously, you're going to pick up some condiments along the way and some other products, but the
Just doing
central,
things
the
because
core
they're
message was one. I'm sorry, what?
I was just doing things because they're trendy is not going to get you anywhere.
Well, no. It made some people a lot of money. Don't
That's
get me wrong,
true.
but if all I cared about was a lot of money, I'd actually have some.
Yeah.
You know, uh,
Point
it was
well.
just like never really the point.
Right. Yeah. Oh, I
Uh,
love the journey that you were kind of taking us on when you were talking about that time when you were with the wolves. And I wondered, was there anything that you had to eat when you were up there that there was like the wildest, most surprising thing that you ate from, your time there that you want to share?
um, well, I mean, we hunted wild Arctic hares because they were fairly numerous um and it was a relatively easy thing to process and consume. And so that was, and it was a first for me because I was raised in the suburbs of the Twin Cities and all of that, and came from a fairly, oh, I don't know.
Urban environment,
Well, I
city,
grew up in a rural, semi-rural setting. There was a lot of woods around, the house where I lived, and I spent all my time out in the woods and stuff. But my family, bought groceries at the grocery store, and the meat came shrink wrapped and all that. I never really had an opportunity to. There just wasn't the occasion. I didn't know anybody that hunted. I did a lot of fishing. I ate a lot of fish I would catch, but um, and so there we are in Ellesmere, and Dave had a 22 along, and we set up targets, and I got to be a pretty good shot. And then one day we're out on the tundra, and there are these two Arctic hare, and it's a beautiful sunny day, and they're standing, on the edge of the fjord, nibbling on purple saxifrage, and they looked like a mated pair to me, and it just, I peered, Dave handed me the gun and said, well, we need to dispatch these, we need to eat tonight. And I aimed and I looked through the viewfinder and I just could not. I couldn't.
couldn't do it.
It's kind of in my nature to want to kind of to protect and to nurture and to rescue and all of that kind of stuff, and it was just too hard for me to pull the trigger. And so I had to hand him the rifle, and he lifted up the gun and he shot twice, and we ate well that night. But I can tell you what a totally different experience consuming something that you looked in the eye of,
Yeah.
earlier that same day.
It
And
makes me think, I don't know if you've ever seen that show Alone. Have you seen that?
oh, I love that series. Yeah, I've
I
seen
love
every
that.
single episode. Yeah.
Me too. I've only seen a couple of them, but it's addicting whenever I get it. I watch the whole thing because it is so fascinating that for those who don't know quickly, it's a show where they're competing. They take them out into the wilderness, drop them off. They have nothing but a few tools,
But
and they're
these are some of the most talented survival experts on the planet. So this isn't like, Survivor, they drop a bunch of people off who don't know anything and,
true.
whatever.
They know
And
what
then
they're
it's
up
most
to. Yeah,
yeah.
they know they have a lot of expertise, and it is fascinating to watch
And
them.
they're filming themselves. They are truly alone.
Yeah, they're truly alone. It is amazing, and that what I always glean from that, and it's sort of like I feel like it's like a win I'm taking because I've had those conversations with people. People, as soon as they know that I'm certified in nutrition, they're like, "Oh, not so much now, but definitely when I first did it, where say the
Hmm.
first thing they would say was, 'Oh, you must be vegetarian,' and I would say no, and they'd be so shocked, and I'd have to have a conversation with them, which wasn't always a convincing one for them.
Yeah.
which I found very frustrating, to be honest. And so anyway, when I watched that show, I'm like, none of the winners went without meat.
Right.
They have
None
to
of
have
them.
meat to win, to stay
You
up
d
there.
Right,
Yeah.
right.
Yeah.
And like the guy who just, like, almost by hand killed that muskox, it was, like, crazy.
Yeah. And
Th
being very,
that was him. I'm like, "Okay, he's gonna win."
yeah. And
I think there was another guy who got a moose, and I think he was also ended up being oh, no, I can't remember whether he had plenty of meat at the end, but what I found so fascinating about that, especially prior to the whole COVID debacle, is that the limiting factor in that series for these people who were the best of the best at what they did. They had just, incredible skill sets of a lifetime of skills of just being out in the middle of nowhere with nothing but but a knife and an axe and just a whole lot of things that they'd learned how to do. And and usually the thing that caused people 90% of the time to tap out was loneliness,
yeah,
because we are a social tribal species. You can be, the people that think that they are going to survive any kind of societal collapse or whatever with just kind of like as the sort of lone wolf in the middle of nowhere in your little bunker with your buckets of beans and rice and then a wall full of ammo. I don't think that's a future worth aspiring to.
mean, wolves have packs for a reason, right?
We are actually more similar to them behaviorally, socially, than we are any other species.
Mm,
And we have also we've shared the planet. Wolves have lived everywhere humans have lived, with the exception of rainforests.
wow.
But we have shared every other kind of ecological niche with wolves, and so we kind of co-evolved. There was a really cool book years ago, Wolves and Humans: Evolution in Parallel, that kind of hypothesized you could learn more about human social structures studying wolves than you could great apes. And
Ooh,
and there is tremendous similarity when you look at our species versus apes that eat a small all great apes eat some meat, usually just, the occasional squirrel or other monkey or something. It's anybody who doesn't believe me can look it up on YouTube. It's grisly to watch, but they still about 80% of their gut is devoted uh, to fermentation, not to hydrochloric acid based digestive system, right?
that's why they
And
have that belly, right? That,
that's why they have the big gut. Looks like they're beer drinkers or something. And the one great ape that doesn't habitually hunt and kill animals for meat are these mountain gorillas and such, that have a brain about a third of the size you would expect for a primate of their size. Um, that they're just sitting around munching on leaves all day long. Uh, but we somewhere along the way, um, and again, probably through major, climate shifts and catastrophe. I think we became human in large part by surviving catastrophes, major changes to our environments. You know, we were good observers. We saw, the animals that we feared the most being at the top of the food chain, and maybe we aspired you know, um, to that. But I probably, even, I mean, was about 4 million years ago. You had Australopithecus afarensis, Lucy, and it was originally believed that Australopithecines were largely vegetarian, and it turns out no. Actually, they made stone tools that designed to cleave meat and marrow, from carcasses,
hmm,
probably as scavengers. And eventually we became, because of that shift in diet that I think we were forced to make, just like we were forced to make a change at the end of we call it the end of the last ice age. We're still in it, still in part of the quaternary ice age. But when after the Younger Dryas or whatever ended rather cataclysmically, we lost 120 species of animals we had relied on for 2.6 million years of our prior evolution in the blink of an eye. And suddenly now we had smaller animals that were leaner and more fleet of foot, and we were forced to make major adjustments. We weren't able to eat woolly mammoths anymore, which I think was a huge part of our diet, and giant oryx and giant sloths and all of
Mm,
these things that suddenly weren't available anymore. That were, by the way, very, very high in fat content, which we would have coveted.
yeah.
And you hear these people on Alone talk about how important fat is for survival. I think the degree to which you can adopt, I would really kind of like to see somebody on that show who that had a ketogenic mindset, because they would have a superior advantage, right?
That's true. Yeah.
In terms of energy, in terms of mental clarity, in terms of being able to most efficiently make use of their body fat, without the struggles that come with blood sugar, problems.
Yeah. I'm glad
Um,
Lucy, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but I had a
no,
note. I was listening to your book on Audible of a primal fat burner, and
yeah.
I'm a big believer that lessons are often taught best with stories. And you mentioned Utsi the Iceman.
Oh, Otzi, yeah, yeah, yeah.
See, okay.
Utsi, Otzi, I don't know. I always
So
called them
yeah,
Otzi,
yeah.
potato,
Um,
potato.
what does
Um,
Utsi teach us about our ancestral diet?
well, so he was discovered back in, was it 1991? It might have been. Um, and this body, there were some hikers hiking up at about 11,000 feet of elevation who came across this human body coming out of, melting out of an ice sheet, and thought, oh my God, foul play or whatever. And they brought people in and discovered, no, this is a major, paleontological find here. This is an ancient so-called prehistoric human, but I think he was deemed to be alive and kicking back maybe 5,200 years ago, something like that. And but this was still part of the Neolithic age. We had already adopted an agricultural lifestyle in a lot of places, and his last meal was not a steak; it was bread. And he was carrying grains, I believe, along with him, along with weapons. I'm sure he ate some meat, but he was just a medical mess. He had um, he had severe dental caries, which, as we know from Weston Price's work, the cultures that maximized the use of animal source foods and minimized agricultural foods by far were the healthiest and the freest from mental and physical malady. And this guy was arthritic, and he had a lot of problems. Um, and you know, yes, he was an ancient human by modern standards, but we've spent less than 0.4% of our entire evolutionary sojourn actually consuming agricultural foods, you know,
Mm,
and things like grains and whatever have you. And maybe 500 generations, contrasted with 100,000 generations of hunting megafauna and eating pretty high fat rich diet. And as we know, there is such a thing as a protein ceiling. If you're eating a lot of lean meat, it's, you've got to, protein can be hard on the body, when it's just protein, right?
mm.
We remember back in the 70s or whatever, there were the liquid protein shakes, and a lot of people got very sick on those, thinking they were going to lose a lot of weight.
Was it like the creatine or what made them sick?
I think it was a lot of the ammonia byproducts that come from the processing of those things,
Oh,
and fats provide a dilution point, I guess. And also, fats aren't just calories, but animal fats in particular are incredibly rich in fat soluble nutrients.
mhm.
And also essential fatty acids and things.
Amino
Um,
acids, yeah.
I mean, everybody thinks you get omega 3s from salmon. Well, okay. depending on how that salmon was raised. But you can get as much omega-3 from a thoroughly grass-fed and finished steak as you can, a portion of salmon. And we consumed a lot of that. And we consumed the brains of the animals that we hunted, which, contained a lot of that. And we're designed to get our omega-3s from the animals that have synthesized them for us. Like anybody who thinks they can fulfill their their need for omega-3 by consuming flax seeds and chia seeds and the oils from those plants and sanchanichi oil and all these other, walnuts. um just don't even get me started on the idea that walnuts are shaped like a human brain. Therefore, I'm sorry, human brain can't make any meaningful use of that form of omega-3 at all. There's a very complex and involved elongation process that occurs from alpha linolenic acid that that and there are these different enzymatic activators along the way that help elongate that into EPA and DHA. And assuming you have you don't have any, metabolic issues, your liver's working great, all this stuff,
Oh,
no nutrient deficiencies, you could maybe convert roughly 3% of alpha linolenic acid into EPA that you're consuming, but you're probably not going to convert any of it into DHA. So, and DHA is the primary fatty acid in the human brain that makes our brains a good bit of, that and arachidonic acid, which also come exclusively from animals. Um, and
interesting.
so, you know, if DHA isn't in your diet, it's not in your brain,
There you go.
right?
You know, we've mentioned a few keywords here, like the paleo diet and the keto and ketogenic and what you've coined that's different. I want to make that differentiate
Yeah,
is the primalgenic
yeah,
way of being.
right, yeah,
Could you talk
yeah,
about what's unique about primalgenic versus these terms that have been now kind of ruined in society? Is that
yeah, right. So I I found myself constantly trying to explain why my point of view is different than what everyone else was hearing, because I didn't want to get lumped in to what everyone else seemed to be doing at that time. It's important for us to be consuming things in as close to the natural state that our ancestors would have recognized as food as possible, and which means consuming not just in the natural state, but from uncompromising sources, right? Not from feedlots, not from, whatever. Um, and um, but I also took, in my approach, I take our physiology, I take, the origins of our species that, from the earliest times forward, what distinguishes us from our supposedly great ape ancestors and things like that. How is it that we came down this other trajectory? Because, you know, um, 4 million, years ago, chimpanzee's brain is still the same size as it is today because they've still eaten the leaves and bananas and maybe the occasional squirrel. But we developed a very different digestive system that was keenly designed to consume, that basically became a hydrochloric acid based digestive system, very similar, much more similar to that of like, cats and wolves and bears and, things like that, that were designed to, other, carnivores to consume large amounts of animal protein. And also, we're uniquely designed to make use of fat. And there's a marvelous paleontologist, anthropologist in Israel. His name is Mickey Bendor, and he wrote a wonderful paper called "Man the Fat Hunter," and he made the case for why it was that it was our pursuit of fat more than it was our pursuit of just, meat,
I'm gonna have to write
that
that down.
ultimately made us human. Yeah, the paper's available online, and he makes an outstanding case for that. And it makes a lot of sense, certainly to me. I've watched wolves hunt their prey. Going back to the original question, I've watched them. It's very hard for them to do what they do, and they work together cooperatively to bring down animals. But 8 out of 10 times, they're not successful. So they tend to target the weak, the older, the sick, the very young sometimes, not because they prefer those foods, but because they're easiest for them to catch.
Mhm.
Well, you know, so, we developed the technology to be able to target whatever we wanted, you know, also using cooperation with others, hunting in pack like kind of situations. But rather than just going after the old, the weak, the sick, we selected for the fattest, sassiest animals we could find. And in fact, there's stories of like Aboriginal hunters in Australia that if they kill a kangaroo in the outback and the body's too lean, they'll leave it in the sun to rot.
Hmm.
Um, that they also, this is not just a northern climate, tendency or an ice age tendency. It's a human tendency to covet, fat. And one of the things I discovered after my book had already gone to print, Primal Fat Burn had already gone to print, and I'm like, damn, I wish I
Yeah.
would have gotten this in there. Ah! So I was doing a lot of talks and things, and I really love cave paintings, and so I was going online and looking up cave paintings that I could maybe use in talks to illustrate certain things, and I started noticing this pattern that, like, you look at the like Chauvet Cave. There's a wonderful documentary, Cave of Forgotten Dreams, I think, um, about that cave and the discovery of it. But the paintings in that cave and the drawings, like when you look at cave lions, you see the musculature. I mean, it was outstanding artwork, beautiful renditions of these animals.
Hmm.
But if they were drawing like a woolly mammoth or a giant auric or whatever, what you got was this thing that looked like it belonged in Macy's Day Parade. This big fat round body and these tiny little stick legs, you know, and it's not like they weren't great artists, like a little kid drawing, weird figures. Um, they knew what they were doing, but we've come to understand, I think, cave art is being largely shamanic in nature. And I kind of think of it, when I look at a lot of this stuff, as maybe kind of a prehistoric vision board, if you will, that they were painting things on the wall that they idealized as something they might be able to attract to themselves, right? To be able to procure in a successful hunt is a fat and sassy, healthy animal. And it was much more dangerous for us to go after those fat, sassy, health. I mean, it's not a trivial thing going after a woolly mammoth.
Yeah.
We could have been trapping rabbits, and that would have been a lot safer. But the rewards greatly exceeded the rewards of successfully hunting an animal like that greatly exceeded the potential risks of going after them. And so
Interesting.
I
Wow.
find myself a little bit annoyed with the crowd that says, well, it was fire that made us human. No, it wasn't. Um, for starters, if a chimpanzee came across a forest fire, came across whatever, they're not going to say, oh yeah, I should make harness this and make use of it. We already had the architecture in our brains that would allow us the sophistication to figure out that making fire was advantageous in part, in significant measure, as a way to keep ourselves warm, and also fend off predators and things like that, for greater safety and all of that. um, but it wasn't fire that made us human, it was fat that made us human. It's fat. Our brains are 80% by dry weight fat,
Mhm.
and made up of fats unique in all of the rest of animal species in the world. Great apes have more of an omega-6 based brain. Ours is omega-3 based, and we have unique cognition that we developed as a result of those dietary preferences. And yeah, I'm not at all convinced that necessarily cooking meat makes meat more digestible, but it does make plants more digestible. And
Mm.
if you're operating from the premise that we're designed to operate on a blood sugar based system, which is, I make the case that no, I don't think that we can make use of glucose as a primary source of fuel. I consider that terribly inefficient.
Mhm.
Um, but if you're making the assumption that blood sugar of necessity is our primary source of fuel, well, then you can make the case that now we could make potatoes available as a nutritional, and we could make plant foods safer for us to consume because we, know that a lot of wild plants, I mean, a good part of my life, I've been really interested in primitive skills and wild foraging, and I have some of those skills. Um, and I find it interesting and I enjoy some of these foods. Um, but it's tedious. You spend a lot of calories going around, and then it's certain times a year this is good, but once it gets past this part, you don't want to eat it anymore. And you know you, there's this, and yeah, don't eat too much of it, because they're
I know a lot.
anti-nutrients.
Yeah.
And yeah, you just and cooking generally makes wild plant foods safer
Mhm.
to consume, but we're not very well designed to make use of. I mean, there may be a lot of nutrients, like for instance, in spinach, there's iron, but chances are you're not going to get any iron from that spinach because they're also, you know, they're anti-nutrient compounds that bind the iron and make it difficult for us to actually even
Like
access.
like the oxalates.
And oxalates are a big problem for a lot of people,
Big
right?
problem. Yeah, more and
Huge
more.
problems.
Well, I love that you have a hot take on that. And let me just recap. This is what I'm getting as a novice to primalgenic way of
Yeah.
being. I'm
Yeah.
getting that it's a prioritization of animal fat in our diet to help us go back to that ancestral way of being, which is as a fat burner. Is that a good way
Right.
to summarize it, or is there more?
Yeah, utilizing so we're designed to make use of one of two types of fuel in a primary way, either sugars or fats, right?
Mhm.
And and protein is generally not well, so anywhere from something like 38 to 54% of protein in excess um of what we consume that we need for rebuilding and repair can get converted to sugar and used the same way, which is why I think diets like the Atkins diet were never truly, I think he called what he did ketogenic at times. It wasn't at all. It was just like, and in his mind, hot dogs were the same thing as a steak, it's just as long as it's meat and, or animal protein and, or soy bars or, whatever he was selling.
Yeah.
So, but the other part of the primalgenic approach that I took, because um, well, for instance, what Weston Price did, because he traveled over 10 years, 100,000 miles across the planet at this unique time in history where there were all these so-called, what he called primitive and also traditional cultures that were still consuming a diet that was consistent with what their ancestors had eaten for a long time. Um, he, what the Aborigines in Australia were eating was very different from what the Inuit were eating, from the people in the South American jungles and people in the Loschental Valley in Switzerland, all these different places. And what a lot of his devotees came away with from nutrition and physical degeneration is, well, just eat real food and that's all good. But he didn't stop there. He asked himself an important question. He said, what did all the healthiest people that I encountered in those travels and that I studied, what did their diets all have in common? And there were at least two things. Number one, well, he couldn't find any vegan cultures anywhere he looked. He was quite disappointed that he was unable to find, a vegetarian tribe someplace or whatever. What he found was that every culture that he encountered that was optimally healthy consumed as many animal source foods as were available to them in the greatest variety possible. But also the most important foods, the most sacred foods, the most sought after foods in all of the cultures that he saw as being optimally healthy were those foods that were richest in fat and fat soluble nutrients.
Which
Bam.
have to be from animals.
Yes, from animals, typically from animals. Obviously, in the tropics, you had a lot of coconut oil and things like that. But fundamentally, you have a basis for what is just kind of a skeletal framework for the optimal human diet, right? And anything else you add to it, one of the things kind of the paleo movement did that I thought was also a mistake is that it made the assumption that anything we would have consumed as an evolving species was somehow optimal for our health. And we can't make the assumption that everything you pick up from the ground or whatever, put in your mouth, chewed, and you don't drop dead eating is necessarily optimizing your health. So how do we know? And one of the things that I did with that, as I looked at some of what was going on in is longevity research.
Mm,
And one thing that was consistent for nearly 100 years of longevity research that had been going on was they discovered that at the animals that they exposed to caloric restriction, they called it, seemed to live a lot longer. And they thought it was just sort of calories in general that were responsible for the longevity in a lot of these animals, that they restricted their intake of nutrients. It seemed to prolong their lives. And what was later discovered along the way, and I go into this in great detail in my first book, Primal Body, Primal Mind. I just tell that whole story. But I'm going to abbreviate.
sure.
You know, is that it actually wasn't calories in general. It was two things. It was the restriction of sugars, which minimized uh, the production of insulin, right?
Mhm.
Which was a really, really, really key part of that equation. And also the moderation of protein.
Mm,
So we require a certain amount of protein day to day. And we can do without the sugars. Of the three major macronutrients, proteins, fats, and carbohydrates, the only one for which there is literally zero established scientifically in any textbook of human physiology or anything anywhere, there is literally a zero requirement for carbohydrate of any kind. We can do everything we need to do with protein and fat, including make sugar if we have to.
there you go.
Our red blood cells require a small amount of glucose because they feed anaerobically, but literally every other cell in the human body can do without it. And it turns out that the less insulin that we produce in the course of our lives, the longer we live and the healthier we are by far. Insulin is not a blood sugar hormone, though.
Mm,
Insulin is actually, its actual purpose is the coordination of our energy stores with reproduction and lifespan. Yeast cells produce insulin. Obviously, they don't have blood sugar, right?
right.
Um, and so it's been kind of misunderstood as being like a blood sugar hormone. And we produce a lot of it in response to the consumption of sugar because unless every molecule of sugar that you don't need right now to outrun a cantankerous woolly mammoth or saber-toothed cat is going to need to go into it's basically considered excess. It
Mm,
needs to be swept out of the bloodstream. Your body's obsessed with maintaining the lowest necessary level of blood sugar because it it's very damaging. It glycates your tissues,
yes.
and it
Ages you.
causes premature aging and everything else. And so that's why insulin is, but you can eat a huge meal and that doesn't necessarily contain a lot of sugar, and you're still going to evoke an insulin response because you have excesses of nutrients that have to be taken off and stored somewhere.
Right.
And so there's that. But there's also um protein is another one of those things. Now, it's maybe a little bit of a um, it's an irony. We have to have some protein, obviously, for rebuilding and repair and maintenance and all of that. But most people don't need more than maybe 5, 6 ounces of complete protein in a day in order to accomplish that. When we start consuming protein in excess of what we require for that maintenance and repair, um, it triggers another metabolic pathway that was a little more recently discovered called mTOR, mammalian target of rapamycin. And it turns out it's a lot of these things again. Um, um, it is centered around kind of a basic idea of what do we need for reproduction? Well, we need excess nutrients. And but when you consume those excess nutrients, your body goes into a mode of a reproductive mode of cellular proliferation, right? Making new cells. When you limit the protein to just what you need, and you get rid of the sugar, but and you limit the protein mostly to just what you need, um, it instead puts you into a mode of, and I like to put it in modern day like economic terms as an analogy. It's too expensive to build a new house right now, so let's fix up the one we've got. And what is getting repaired and regenerated is you
Mm.
on a cellular level. We go into autophagy. Your body starts focusing more on
Unre-
clearing out the debris, from cells that we don't, that we need to get rid
And you want
um,
that as opposed to duplication of excess cells.
of
Yeah.
making lots of, well, so if you are, an infant, a child, a teenager, or pregnant, lactating woman, whatever, your demands are going to be high. You need to be in that mode, to some degree, um, in order to make new cells because you're growing and whatever. But once we reach a certain ripe old age, where we're becoming um, less reproductively active, we've achieved the sort of um, we're not growing anymore or whatever, and maybe we're not having children anymore. Then if you have spent your lifetime in the kind of contaminated environment we're all enjoying today,
Mhm.
um, and you have cells mutating all over the place, and then you give those cells an impetus to reproduce willy-nilly, that is a
Super fast.
core tenet of cancer, right?
Right. Yep. Yep.
And
Yep.
that's consistent in one mechanism that is consistent in all cancers, regardless of whatever cause it, because it's not the cancer cell
Mhm.
that kills you, right? It is the mass proliferation of that cancer cell,
There you go.
the unchecked proliferation,
Wow. That's so,
metastasis, right?
yeah, so
mTOR
interesting.
mTOR is, so everybody seems to understand that sugar is a cancer fuel and insulin is a cancer fuel, and all that kind of thing, lactic acid, etc. Um, but what most people don't understand is that mTOR plays a role in every single cancer, um, and that moderating protein intake is really, really important in that respect
Interesting.
from
No,
preventing excessive cellular proliferation.
I want to ask you one question first, and that is, do you have time to go over
Oh,
our?
yeah, yeah,
Okay, good.
yeah.
Okay, 'cause I have several more questions to ask you. But on this topic, it's so fascinating of cancer and mTOR and modified protein. So, I've been hearing a lot lately about you need X amount of ounces of protein every day based on your body weight. What's your point of view on that?
Well, so about 0.8 grams per kilogram of what I call estimated ideal body weight, because we all remember how ideal we looked in high school, assuming we weren't obese, but most people have an idea
Sure.
of what their ideal weight is. Base it on that because that's probably going to be your leanest, right? I mean, unless you want to look Rubenesque, which most people, we have distorted perceptions nowadays, but most people, know they look best when they're leaner. So when you use your estimated ideal body weight, because a lot of the calculations to moderate mTOR are based on your lean tissue mass, which is very difficult to get an accurate measurement of, without getting into a big water tank and whatever else and doing these kinds of displacement testing. I'm not overly trusting of the you know electrical displacement methods that are used and whatever else. But most people are not going to go out and do that.
Hmm.
So I kind of use that litmus. What is your estimated ideal body weight? Multiply that by point. Uh, Divide that by 2.2. Here in the States anyway, when we're not very metric, we're not here in the States. We don't measure our body weight in kilograms, right? So figure out your body weight in kilograms, multiply that by 0.8, and you'll have an approximate value. Now, if
Of
you're a big
ounces?
bodybuilder or you're,
Is that a value of ounces of protein per day?
grams,
Gram, sorry.
but you have to understand there's like, about 7 grams of protein in an ounce of meat, for instance, that kind of a thing. So you, because steaks are, more than half of what makes up, steak is like water, and then there are the different kinds of fats. Even in a regular beef steak, it's still going to be predominantly unsaturated, monounsaturated fats that dominate over saturated fats, but there's some saturated fats and
Right.
other kinds of fats and things like that, and
Hmm.
other minerals and nutrients. So it's not that 0.8 grams per kilogram isn't the amount of meat that you consume, it's the amount of protein. You understand there's 6 to 8 grams of protein in an egg, for instance, depending on the size of the egg, and
Yes. Okay. I have to get my calculator out and
yeah,
figure.
yeah, yeah. You have to do a tiny little look in
Yeah.
the dictionary under math anxiety. It says to see Nora, because it's like I am horseshit at math. I'm
Me
just really
too.
bad at it.
I'll admit it. Yeah, I am too.
But
Oh,
these are not difficult calculations,
true.
and
True.
I provide the details. I also have an online course I call the Primalgenic Plan,
Yes. Yes. Oh, I love
3 week
that.
meal by meal kind of. It sort of handholds people through the process of adopting this different way of eating. And you know a point I'll make is that fat is exempt from these nutrient issues around cancer and whatever else, except for like rancid fat, very bad,
Yes.
obviously. Rancid anything isn't good for anybody. Rancid cholesterol is not good for anybody, but cholesterol is part of what defines us as a species or as a mammal, right?
Amen.
You have
Yes.
to be an animal to have cholesterol.
Hmm.
A few years ago, there was a discovery made, probably close to a decade ago now, um, of a fossil, I think deep in the ocean floor, and they brought it up and they looked at it and they said, well, it's the oldest life form they ever found, and they were trying to figure out, was this a plant or an animal of some kind? And in their analysis, using tools I don't pretend to understand, they were able to find a signature for cholesterol, and they went, oh, animal, you know
Mm, interesting.
it's what defines us,
Defines
and a fourth of all the cholesterol in your body as a human is up here,
is in your
and
brain.
it gosh darn well better be there,
That's
because your
right.
brain cannot function well without it. One of the most common side effects that I ran into in my practice, for instance, working with the brain, um, was people getting on statins and now developing dementia-like symptoms, and having
Just
trouble remembering things, and
just
their
so
moods.
opposite, upside down of what everyone thinks they know in this modern day society. It's so sad. And I just so fascinated by hearing you talk, Nora, that I just happen to be a listener for a lot of this. But
Yeah, yeah.
I do have three rapid fire questions
All
because
right.
they are sort of your hot takes, I'll call it. I love it when someone has a hot take or someone has, another opinion besides what people just accept as true. And you
Mm-hmm.
mentioned this first one. Number one is you mentioned it already, the phrase, and I'd love to hear why you think this. I heard you say, or maybe it was in the book, I'm not sure where I picked this up, that the quote unquote just eat real food is just not rational. So can you tell us why?
Yeah, it was again, it's that assumption that just because something is natural grew out of the ground, and you put it in your mouth and eat it and swallow it, doesn't necessarily mean it's something you could either make good use of, or it's that it's even doing you any good, or that it isn't doing more harm than good.
Right.
And so we have to understand that that uh in order to optimize our diet, we have to understand something about, like the longevity research stuff that I bring into the whole primalgenic approach. um but also there are ways of optimizing nutrient intake to maximize our brain function, to maximize, um, our health and longevity and all of that. Um, the other issue, though, is also that a lot of the nutrients, again, that are present in plants, when you look at animals that eat, uh, they're designed to eat a plant-based diet 100%.
Hmm.
Ruminants,
Yeah.
different kinds of herbivores. Well, for starters, what are they doing all day long? Their faces are in the bushes, they're in the grass, they have to eat constantly. And all
Yeah.
of that goes into a huge fermentation vat, which we lack.
Right.
And that is converted through bacterial action and through, rumination or whatever else into nutrients that are actually usable for them. And, if you've ever made homemade kraut or whatever from cabbage, from fermenting things like cabbage, you're going to get 300% more vitamin C out of
Mm.
that fermentation process than you would from the cabbage that it was made from. That's
Right.
part of what fermentation does, is it amplifies the nutritional value of plant-based foods for ruminant animals. That, you have something like a deer or an elk. We have a lot of these animals around here. um they have to eat all day long in order to manufacture a lot of the nutrients from those raw materials. We
Right.
don't have that capability. We just don't.
Yeah. It's
Only
fascinating.
about 20% of our digestive tract is devoted to fermentation.
Mm.
And most of the nutrients that are made in that fermentation process are actually designed to feed the colonocytes of our colon, right? The cells of
Yeah.
our colon, as opposed to feeding us nutrition. But I'll make another interesting point, that all large mammals are actually designed to rely on fat as a primary source of fuel, even ruminants.
Mm.
Because a cow, 80% of a cow's energy does not come from carbohydrates, does not come from glucose. It comes from short chain fatty acids like butyrate and propionate, and,
So that's
um,
what's created
from
what.
the bacterial fermentation of all that fiber that they've consumed.
Mm.
So they're relying on short chain fatty acids. We don't rely on those as much, and we're not really able to manufacture short chain fatty acids in the quantities necessary to sustain ourselves. But ketones have 4 times the energy value, which are the water soluble energy units of fat. Um, provide us with 4 times the energy value of either free fatty acids or carbohydrates alone. And we are literally the only species on Earth that is actually capable of making full-time use. Our brains are the only ones capable of making full-time use of ketones. There's no other animal able to do that. To
Well,
me,
that.
there's a good reason for that. And it is a selective advantage. I
Mm.
did this weird experiment. It was an n of one Nora experiment, that I did. I don't try this at home, kids. Um, but I was curious how long I could go without eating, right?
Yeah.
And I was already ketogenically adapted going into it, right? And I drank water, maybe a cup of tea, in the morning and that kind of thing. And then I was testing my ketones and my blood glucose and whatever. And I managed to get to 21 days without eating anything.
Really?
Yeah, and at that point I thought, okay, me and Gandhi, cool. I'm done. And it's not that I never experienced a drop in my energy, my cognitive function. Um I I was just as functional on day 21 as I was on day 1.
What did
And
you do when you got hungry?
it was kind of like having an itch I couldn't scratch. And I wasn't experiencing major hunger. I didn't have that,
Mm,
because my body, I was able to make energy, and I had good nutrient stores and things like that, which I probably depleted more than I should have during that exercise. But what the message is that, in an environment where you're sort of feast or famine, right, as an evolving species, if you can cultivate that fat burning metabolism and you're able to get your brain running on mostly nothing but ketones. I'll say mostly because from time to time, maybe you eat a berry or, whatever,
sure.
but, um, tremendous advantage. Most people are not much more than 1 or 2 meals away from a state of total metabolic chaos. Think of
Mm,
the person, I haven't eaten anything yet today, and I'm going to chew somebody's arm off, or rapidly become the thing that rhymes with itchy, right?
right.
Or they get the fatigued or their brain fogged, and they're just like, I can't function, or whatever.
Yeah.
Um, and if you're operating on a ketogenic, um, metabolism, food becomes more of a choice as opposed to just this, I I have to eat something, all
Yeah.
the
That's the
time.
sugar burner
you're
talking.
you're able to think more clearly, right?
Yeah.
And that, again, selective advantage for survival. If you can think, and you can be creative, and you can strategize, and you're not just sitting there going, oh my god, what am I
Mode.
going to do?
Oh, that's fascinating, especially since I'm sort of doing a modified fast right now. And
Yeah.
I've been surprised how I've been okay to not eat at 3 meals a day like I'm used to eating. I've been surprised, but I'm using bone broth to help me get through.
Well, and bone broth actually does that, have a lot of glycine that can raise your blood sugar. I'm just
Mm,
saying. So I'm not opposed to bone broth. I love it, and I make soups with it and things like that. But it is something that can kind of throw you off if you do an awful lot of it.
mm,
Um, but that said, you know, I think the whole fasting thing. I'm okay if people want to eat within a certain window during the day and all that kind of stuff. But the problem that we have with the whole fasting craze, and again, it's predicated on the whole caloric restriction thing, right? Which is fine, but fasting is not a nutritional strategy.
mm.
And 50 years ago, you know uh something that we grew in a garden or whatever else to consume probably had way higher nutrient content. I mean, we know that there have been things done to evaluate the
Sure.
nutritional value of foods grown in, rich versus depleted soils. And almost all our soils are depleted, even if you're growing organically. There are
Yeah,
things you can do to supercharge your soils, and that's a whole other conversation.
true. Yeah.
Um, but that said, so we're eating food, even if we're eating organically and uncompromisingly, our food still doesn't have the nutrient value it once did.
Mm,
Now you're skipping meals on top of that. So
good.
you
Yeah.
may, develop, go into autophagy, and it may be helpful that way, but there may be diminishing returns over time because you are allowing your body to deplete your nutrient stores that are compromised to begin with, just because of the age that we live in and all the other crap that's being, coming out of the asses of airplanes and whatever else that's going into our soils, the glyphosate and everything else.
Right.
um so,
Interesting. Another
so
hot take you gave me there. That's good. Yeah, no, I
I'm a
like
hot gal, what can I say,
Oh, that makes me think about, so I took some coconut oil and I put it in a little candy mold and I put it in the refrigerator.
mm,
So maybe having some of those might be a better strategy.
sure.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, is, so I don't have a huge problem with people eating within a certain window, but it is really important to meet your nutrient requirements. It's just, and when you're operating on a ketogenic, metabolism, food eating becomes much more of a choice. Like, I can forget to eat for half the day and just not even think about it. And then I'm going, oh God, I probably should eat something, because I can't, you can't just keep going and depleting yourself that way.
Right. Oh, that's
Um,
a good point. Okay, I have another
so Yeah,
point.
go for it.
Another question is this idea of balance, because I hear it so much with people I know, this philosophy of everything in moderation, and know that I've done I've done the elimination diet. So I have my own hot take on that. I have a feeling we
Yeah.
agree. Can we talk to people who might be lying to themselves, saying that everything in moderation is
Is
okay?
a rationalization. These are the people that said, yeah, my Aunt Tilly lived to 108 and she drank a fifth of whiskey and ate, Rice Krispies every day. I don't know. I
Right.
mean, there are people that have, these sirtuin genes activated that just sort of have this natural advantage genetically. They can do whatever they want. Um, and they seem to do okay. Most of us are not so fortunate. And honestly, I mean, how much metabolically deranging and toxic and antigenic and whatever would you like to enjoy in moderation? I mean, really.
Right.
I mean, how much wiggle room do any of us have now?
Yeah.
And just even a decade ago we had more wiggle room than we have now. I mean,
True.
things are really, really compromising. We have very little wiggle room in terms of what it takes to be to have any semblance of health, actually, much less be optimally healthy in this day and age. And where our ancestors probably consumed a couple hundred different varieties of plants and animals and things like that, most people consume about 17 different types of plants,
Yeah.
plant-based foods. And, everything is kind of bottlenecking and narrower and narrower.
Mm.
And autoimmune is probably the single greatest health burden in the world. And most people don't know it because most people are not diagnosed until, well, the standard in conventional medicine is at a point at which about 95% tissue destruction has occurred. Then you're diagnosable, and then they have nothing for you. They'll just give you palliative care with pharmaceuticals. Um, Finding out what kinds of things are triggering that autoimmune is a whole other discussion and a whole other process. And it's an area of strength for me because I'm the only member of my family that doesn't have an autoimmune condition.
Mm.
And I don't want one.
Yeah.
Um, but I'm just saying, and now in this age of not just cancers, but turbo cancers, which is a whole other discussion, but it's a whole different conversation we're having now than we would have had just even a few short years ago. And nobody that I've met has any wiggle room whatsoever.
Yeah.
I mean, people think they're getting away with something, but
You're not going to know until it's too late
a
almost.
lot of times these processes take a while to manifest themselves.
Yeah.
So I guess, and with the very understandable and if not applaudable distrust of the mainstream medical system nowadays, you know, I'm always frustrated with the person that says, well, you got to die of something,
Yeah.
right? So I'm just
Yeah.
going to eat what I want and do my own thing. And I think what they imagine is they're going to be sitting there enjoying their Krispy Kreme and they're just going to keel over and drop dead, right? That's not how it happens most of the time.
It's the suffering that you want to
It's the
avoid.
suffering, it's strokes and heart attacks and things that cancer diagnoses and things like that aren't just ending your life prematurely, but are burdening your family and causing immense stress all around you. And of course, even prior to recent times, shall we say, I was saying in my talks 10 years ago, the number one cause of bankruptcy in the United States is a bad diagnosis,
Mm.
and that's never been more true than now. And if you get that bad diagnosis, do you really give a rat's patootie of what, whatever the global elites are up to or anything else? You don't care about anything but surviving one day to the next. Your whole focus just goes into survival, and that's it.
True.
It's not about, I remember, Dave Asprey and I were sitting he was running some interviews out of this hotel room down in Austin. So he was interviewing me. It's actually one of my favorite interviews. It was a good one.
Mm.
But he said, well, I'm going to live to 160. I don't know, whatever he said. I plan to live this. How long are you going to live? And I said, well, I could walk out of here at the end of the interview and get hit by a bus, you know?
Yeah.
I don't really give a rat's ass, actually. I mean, what I care about is not the quantity of my life, it's the quality of my life. That when I'm older, that I still have my mobility, I still have my cognitive faculties. I know who I love and who loves me, and I'm able to have a full appreciation of life and an enjoyment of it. Not hooked up to an oxygen tank or, whatever else that comes with, extreme old age. And I'm not sure I want to live 160 years and outlive everybody else I know and love either.
Right. It sounds like a
Um,
vampire's life.
yeah, I mean, it's if you're doing the anti-aging thing, in my mind, what you are doing, when I take this sort of longevity approach, it's not about adding years to your life. It's about adding life to your years, right? It's about minimizing the prospect of disease.
Yeah.
And if you live long enough, cancer is typically in the equation, and now more than ever before. And so anything you can do to, address the mechanisms of those things and just kind of minimize, all we can do is the best we can do, right? But to
Yeah.
minimize your exposure to things are compromising,
Yes.
and maximize your choices around what is going to nourish and build you up. And also, it's not just about beef and chicken and steak and whatever else. It's nose to tail, right? It's organ meats, like the ultimate superfood in this world. It's not turmeric. It's not any plant-based anything. It's liver. There,
Liver.
there are more nutrients in liver. And by the way, the vitamin A in liver, the the there is no such thing as plant-based vitamin A. Beta carotene is not vitamin A. It is provitamin A. It takes at least 20 units of beta carotene to manufacture a single unit of vitamin A, and you'll never meet your vitamin A requirements. All true vitamin A comes from animal source food.
It's a great segue, by the way, because I can't let you go without asking you a little bit about the organization that you're a part of, because I do
Right.
think that at least some people are more aware of Weston Price, but not many people know about Francis Pottenger.
Right.
Could you,
Pottinger's cats.
yeah, illuminate that a little bit for the audience?
Well, and Brent Pottinger actually wrote the foreword to my first book.
Oh, nice.
Yeah, which was super cool. But Francis Pottinger was a physician who he ran the series of experiments with cats, and he was interested in seeing, I guess, how different dietary approaches affected the health and longevity of these animals. So there was one group of cats that were fed a diet that was largely natural to cats. In other words, raw meat and whatever else. There was probably some raw milk thrown in. Not that that's natural for cats, but okay. And then there was cooked food, everything cooked. And then there was strictly processed food diets. So there were three groups of cats. And one generation to the next, the cats that were allowed to eat a diet that was species appropriate, thrived. They had healthy babies, healthy kittens, and they lived long, healthy lives. They seemed to had healthy teeth and healthy organs and skeletal structure. And with the cooked food diets, you started to see some compromises, not so much in the first generation, but in subsequent generations, there was a gradual deterioration. Now, when you went to fully processed food diets, that deterioration became precipitous.
And then,
And
right?
it literally, by about the 10th generation, the processed food fed cats couldn't even reproduce anymore, and they were neurotic. They had abnormally narrow facial structure and distorted skeletal structure, even distorted looking organs in their bodies. And yes, it's a perfect kind of window into what we're doing to ourselves as we get further and further away from, I mean, Cro-Magnon humans had a brain that was 20% larger than the one we have today. And in just the last 10,000 years since we adopted an agricultural lifestyle, we've lost 11% of our total brain volume. You know,
We are
but
living in Pottinger's cats.
it's one of the chapters in Primal Body, Primal Mind that asks the question, what generation of Pottinger's cat are you?
Mm.
But But the moral of the story in the end, and the really hopeful thing, I'm not into hopium, but the hopeful thing was that he reversed the experiment a little bit, and he took severely deteriorated cats, from generations of crappy eating, and restored them to their species appropriate diet, and was able to restore completely normal, healthy, robust, natural health within about 4 generations, is all it took to suddenly bring that species, that animal back, that
Wow.
lineage or whatever of cats back to
Yeah.
healthy, robust, natural state.
It speaks to the resiliency of the human body that we can fix it if we catch it in time and we can turn things around
That's right.
ourselves and future generations.
We have control. There's all this stuff put on genetics, like that is the be all. No, we have control of about 98% of everything around all of that. We all have genes for all kinds of things, good or bad, right? What determines whether or not a gene expresses itself depends on um, whether those genes are being activated or not, largely by epigenetic factors. In other words, what it is you choose to eat, what you expose yourself to in your environment, and whatever else. And I in so many ways, I mean, I've had an amazing life, and I am so grateful to have lived the life that I've lived. In many respects, I'm um, the happiest I've ever been, from the standpoint that I'm living in the closest alignment of my lifetime to a natural environment. I live on a 50-acre homestead in the middle of nowhere at 4,000 feet in the mountains
Mhm.
of Idaho. And I'm growing a lot of my own food, raising some of my own food, trying to kind of, it's a steep learning curve when you're trying to do it all yourself. But the water coming into my home comes out of a spring on the hill that just rolls down the hill and into the house, and it's clean
Amazing.
spring water. And there's never been a chemical on this property ever, because the
Wow.
people that have lived here have just always really respected and loved the land and wanted to do the right thing in the right way for the right reasons. And um, so it's about as clean as it gets. But and I'm up high enough that I don't think I get a whole lot of drift from what's happening on the farmers' fields below and things like that.
Mhm.
But there's still stuff coming out of the sky, and whatever else.
Sure.
Again, all we can do is the best we can do.
Yeah.
But when you live close to nature, like I have the opportunity and the privilege to do now, you really, um, there is something very special about living in that close alignment with the natural world that puts so much stuff into perspective,
Yeah.
you know?
Yeah.
And
Wonderful.
every day I no longer require a gym membership, because I'm living, it's physically demanding to live on a homestead and all
Yeah.
day long. And especially lately, it's been a lot of snow removal, but you're constantly having to be active, and you're constantly noticing what's happening around you. You have to pay attention to the weather and to whatever. And when you live in a place where there are mountain lions and bears and and whatever else that may want to make a meal out of you at some point, you're forced to kind of notice what's out there. Um
Keeps you.
and I'm not afraid of any of it, but I have a healthy respect for the environment in which I live, and I compensate for that however I have to.
Yeah.
But
Oh, sounds beautiful. I hope
yeah.
you maybe one day you'll do a retreat and I can come help you home.
Yeah. Well, if you're ever looking for a getaway or something, you'd be welcome. Yeah.
That'd be so cool.
It's a magnificent place. It really is. And it's very comfortable here. And
Sounds just beautiful. Well,
yeah.
before I let you go, because this fascinating conversation, Nora, I've just had such a wonderful time listening to you and
Oh, it's
learning.
been fun. Yeah.
Yeah. And so before I let you go, of course, I have to ask you, where can the great people find you?
Well, my main website is primalbody-primalmind.com. That's where my blog is. And I have I kind of went black for a couple of years because I've been living here now 4 years and in the middle of nowhere, and it's taken up until now to kind of get up to speed.
Sure.
where I'm able to start thinking about writing and, whatever. I'm kind of done traveling, um, but that said, I also have some online courses. I have a year-long certification course I teach in addition to, I have a 3-week program I call the Primalgenic Plan, week by week, meal by meal, kind of path to adopting this way of eating. And I've gotten really, really, really good feedback from that. And my certification course students and I we're like family. We meet live every week for an hour or two, and share. We actually talk about everything, not just food, but if they have health questions, we go into that
Sure.
and whatever have you. And so I have my primalcourses.com website. I have a blood sugar course on there too, and some other things. So
Awesome. Is the Primalgenic, the 3-week one you mentioned, is there a live component or is it a course that you can do on your own?
no, it's a course you do on your own
Okay.
at your own pace, but it was really carefully thought out, and I'm quite proud of it. I think it's well structured, and people have given me some very good feedback.
Who would be a great candidate for that in case someone's listening and goes, "Hey, is that right for me?"
Um, well, what you want to do, what you might want to do, you can either go and listen to a whole bunch of my, interviews and my talks and whatever. You could pick up my books, and I don't, it's not a get rich quick scheme to say go out and get the book because I'm not really making a lot of money from that.
Sure.
But it would give you a kind of a like a, oh, okay, this is what it involves, and these are the advantages and and maybe the disadvantages of some other ways of doing things. But anybody who, you know, maybe has health compromises that they're concerned about, or they're concerned about developing health compromises, or they have metabolic compromises of different kinds or whatever,
Yeah.
and they just want to do things a better way that's going to maybe minimize their need for, say, oh, I don't know, conventional medical care or whatever.
Intervention. Yeah. Just
Yeah, that kind of thing, when you
yeah,
want
like
to
someone who
minimize.
wants to really cut through the noise and get healthy and find out what you're really supposed to be doing at the core of it all. It sounds like to
Right.
me.
Yeah, you know we are these miraculous beings with extraordinary immune systems, with it, it's this whole, everybody sort of has this fear that disease is out to get me. Well, no, health is out to get you. Your body is fantastically designed to keep you healthy and keep you regenerating, as long as you're giving it what it needs in order to do that, and not compromising it by making choices that make that more difficult. And so
Right
when
there.
you
Give
have
it
that,
the reins.
yeah,
Wow. Well, I'm sure we could talk forever. We could talk
I'm sure
another
we could.
while another
Easy.
episode
I'm
maybe.
just getting warmed up. So
But I just want to say I'm so grateful for you being here. For everyone else who's curious about Nora's work, I hope you go check out her websites at primalcourses.com, and I'll, of course, and Primal Body hyphen Primal Mind. I'll put that all in the show notes so you know where
cool.
to find her. And for that, I'll just say, everybody out there, remember, stay happy so you can stay healthy. And I'll see you on the next one. Psst, can you do me a favor? Text the link to this episode to a friend who you know needs to hear this. By doing so, you are helping me with my mission to open minds to all the holistic health solutions that are available to us all. We hope you'll support our small business and shop ngvitamins.com for all your supplement needs. Oh, and don't forget to follow, hit the bell on your platform of choice so you never miss an episode. If you enjoyed this show, please consider sharing your review on iTunes. Until next time.